Hi, I'm Dan Barker, and welcome to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's first Ask an Atheist Facebook Live show of 2018.
I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor. Dan and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
I'm Andrew Seidel, FFRF's Director of Strategic Response and one of the 9 constitutional attorneys here at FFRF. Tens of thousands of Iranians have taken to the streets since December 28th in the largest protest that country has seen since 2009. The protest began peacefully, but as we speak, reports suggest that at least 20 protesters have been killed and hundreds have been arrested. The state has facilitated pro-government counter-marches, and with us to discuss these events is Maryam Namazie.
Maryam Namazie is a good friend of ours. She's an Iranian-born secularist and a human rights activist. She's a spokesperson for One Law for All, the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, and Fitna. Islamic Iranian media outlets have called Maryam immoral and corrupt. I don't know if she considers that a compliment or not, but Maryam has done a lot of work to help Iranian refugees. Last fall, here in Madison, Maryam Namazie received the Henry H. Zumak Freedom from Religious Fundamentalism Award. And we've invited Maryam to be on today's Ask an Atheist to give us some insight into the groundswell of protest going on right now in Iran. So, Maryam, welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist, and you're live from London, aren't you?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's great to see all three of you.
Well, we wish we could see you.
Well, she's going to fix the monitor here in a second.
So, Maryam, when did you leave Iran?
I left Iran a long time ago in 1980, a year after the Islamic regime took power, and I've been living in various countries. I lived in India, and then the UK, and then the US, and now I'm back living in Britain since 2000.
So, of course, we wanted you on the show to give us some insight about what's going on now in Iran. Can you briefly summarize it and what you know about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the protests in Iran, of course, have been ongoing just because the Islamic regime there is so antithetical with 21st century life. So there have been ongoing protests, but of course, this latest one is quite different than previous protests. It has to do with, of course, the level of poverty, unemployment in the country, corruption that exists from the government side. You know, you've got nearly 2/3 of the population in Iran living under the poverty line. You've got large numbers of people who are unemployed. And of course, the government's mismanagement and complete disregard for people's welfare has very much now come to a head, and people are, focusing on the government as well. So it's anti-poverty, anti-corruption, but very much targeting the Islamic regime of Iran. And one thing that's different now is that there are no illusions towards the so-called reformist faction. People are opposed to both those factions. And what's really interesting about the protests is that they're deeply secular, they're very modern, and very universalist in their approach. So they're, the slogans clearly talk about an end to an Islamic regime. People say that they want freedom, and people even criticize Islam, saying Islam has been used as a stepping stone, and people are fed up. So it's actually a very exciting time. Of course, also very nerve-wracking because people are being killed, they are being arrested, but nonetheless, they're not willing to back down. And I think that's another thing we're seeing that's quite brave and courageous and wonderful to witness.
Now, we've read that some of the anger is because people, especially working class people, have become aware that billions of tax dollars are going to the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, to these religious foundations that really cater to elite clergy. Is that part of the issue?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. A lot of the slogans are around the fact that the Islamic regime of Iran is intervening in foreign countries countries such as Syria, such as Iraq, such as supporting the Hezbollah in Lebanon. All this money is also going towards supporting Islamism abroad, whereas people are actually starving in a country that is very rich in oil and various industries. And that's a big part of it. And again, if you look at the places that people are attacking, they've actually attacked a religious seminary, for example. Mullahs who passed by the protest, their chants saying, clergymen, be ashamed, let go of this country. So there is a huge focus on the Islamic regime, its various organs like the Revolutionary Guard, the Basiji, the militias, who've really suppressed people for so long, and it has all come to a head.
So Maryam, your TV show continues to broadcast in Iran. Is that true, Bread and Roses?
Yeah, it's still broadcast in Iran because it's using satellite dishes that are outside of Iran. And a lot of people in Iran do have satellite dishes just because the Iranian regime's TV is so rubbish and it's full of religious propaganda. And so it is a way of reaching large numbers of people. And of course, there are other media also that broadcast in that way. So it's a great way of being in touch with people in Iran and also reflecting some of the issues that are of concern.
So in the last few days,
everywhere.
In the last few days, have you been hearing from anybody in Iran as some of your contacts there?
Yeah, I think people there are very excited. They feel that a real change could be possible. And I think it's a very hopeful thing. Some of the iconic images that we're seeing from the protests, very much a woman-led protest. It's a very female revolution, a very female rebellion. And, you see women waving their compulsory veil, for example, women who are standing up to the Revolutionary Guards and the security agents and saying death to Khamenei or down with Khamenei. That's something that's an offense punishable by death. Nonetheless, there are so many of these iconic, wonderful, historic moments, really, not just for people in Iran, but for human, sort of human society and human civilization. And so I think people are excited. But the thing is, though, that they are concerned as well. They need real solidarity. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump or Theresa May in the UK. I'm talking about people-to-people solidarity, like we saw during the anti-apartheid period, where people supported the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. We need to support this anti-gender apartheid movement, anti-Islamic regime movement, and pro-universal rights and secularism that's taking place in Iran. And that's something that we need a lot more of, and pressure on governments to continue to not have relations with the regime, not help to prop it up anymore, and allow people to deal with this regime once and for all.
Well, Maryam, what can our members and people who are watching this do to support their Iranian brothers and sisters?
I think there's lots of ways we can support it. Is one, to put pressure on Western governments not to intervene militarily or otherwise, and to put pressure on governments to stop wheeling and dealing with the Islamic regime of Iran and allowing, rights, human rights, to take precedence over profit and, investments that they're concerned about. And also, I think people can just help to highlight the struggle. It's important for people to realize that, especially in a world in which identity politics reigns supreme and people are seen to be, all are seen to be Muslims, Iranian society is seen to be so-called Islamic. I think what the protests show very clearly is that, cultural relativism is a bogus sort of idea and theory. In fact, people everywhere want universal rights, they want freedoms. And for people really, especially those who live under a theocracy, secularism is so key in living in a society where women and men could be treated more equally. And of course, a lot of the problems we're seeing today could be addressed.
Maryam, have you ever been able to go back to Iran yourself?
Unfortunately, I've never been back since I left. it's because I can't go back. But there is a joke amongst all of us that every time something happens in Iran, we ask each other, well, have you packed your suitcases? Are you ready to go back now? And so, this is something a lot of exiles are talking about. Obviously, it's a very, very exciting situation in Iran. We want to be able to support it any way we can. I think whilst we live abroad, at least we can help to raise attention on the issue, highlight, the protests, and also make sure that we mobilize support and solidarity for this movement. But the reality is that when the Islamic regime of Iran was established, it was established on the back of a revolution that was not Islamic, but it used that as a way of saying that Islamism and Islamic regimes are people's demand and desire. And of course, if a popular revolution can get rid of an Islamic regime in Iran, it will have huge repercussions across the world for human rights, for universalism, and against the religious right and the terrorism that we face today everywhere.
No, I don't like to be a naysayer, but the Arab Spring really fizzled. And we can see what's going on in Egypt. What could make this different in Iran?
Well, of course, nothing is guaranteed in any struggle for people's rights. I mean, you know that better than most. It's a constant battle. You win some, you lose some. And of course, human lives are at stake, human rights are at stake. So it's a very serious matter. Again, no fight is guaranteed. If it was guaranteed, we could just sit and wait for things to change and become better. It is a fight. And, people in Iran who are unarmed, who are protesting and using their only potential of free expression, really, are faced with one of the most brutal, violent regimes in the 21st century. And so they need unequivocal support. They need the utmost support that we can give them. And that means, highlighting the issues, defending them, standing with them, and making sure that there are no interventions and allowing people to take this own course. I mean, one of the things we're seeing is Western governments trying to push forward, sectarian groups or the former monarchy. You see the BBC doing that as well. And, this is, again, we don't want anything manufactured, imposed from above. People need to be able to get rid of the regime and to have a society in which they can make real decisions without any sort of repression and impositions from anywhere else.
Maryam, I'm curious about what you think the role of technology might be in these protests. You already mentioned that you thought they were modern protests. We talked a little bit about how you were beaming your show into Iran using pirate satellites. I read a stat that said in the 2009 protests, only about 1 million Iranians had smartphones, and now the estimate is 48 million, and they're using social media to organize and apps like Telegram. Do you think that is playing an important role in these protests?
Yeah, definitely. I think the social media has played a huge role because, for one, we're able to see from people themselves what's actually happening. Because in the past, media was controlled by governments and there was very little information. We often only saw what CNN or Fox News or the Islamic Republic's broadcasting service wanted us to see. And now everybody with a phone is a potential journalist, is a potential citizen who is beaming the truth and reality to the entire world. So that makes a huge difference, of course. And that's why it's so important to put pressure on Google, on Twitter, on Telegram, and other vehicles, social media vehicles that are being used, not to censor because the Iranian regime requested, but to make sure that access is open to people so that they can, highlight what's going on and give us the latest of what's happening.
But isn't the government cracking down on social media? And people are finding ways to get around it, but isn't Telegram one of those social media implements that they are trying to stop?
Yeah, I mean, they always have throughout their 40 years, they have tried at various times when there are protests to censor and to shut down the internet, to shut down various social media. But of course, people go through various filters and try to access it via other means. And so what we need to ensure is that at least the Facebook and Twitter and all that, they do not help in the censorship, and leave it open for access so that people can go through their various ways and access social media, because it is an important way in which people can get the word out and also hear about all the human solidarity that's taking place internationally in their defense, not by regressive governments that have very often supported the Iranian regime despite and irrespective of the mass human rights violations that have been taking place, but people-to-people solidarity. It will give hope. Just as seeing a woman waving white flag, her white headscarf, gives people, feminists and secularists around the world, hope. In the same way, when people in Iran see protests and actions and acts of solidarity in their defense, it will also give them hope and help them in their fight.
So I want to ask, you said, Maryam, that this is primarily a secular protest that's happening. Isn't it true, though, that most Iranians are at least nominally Muslim, and they're protesting not so much freedom to believe, but the control of Islam over the population?
Well, I mean, I think that even if people are believers, Muslims, as you say, of course, there are, I'm sorry about that. Of course, there are, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not secularists, of course. And this is one of the important things, is that, you know, when you look at the slogans that are taking place in these protests, you see that they are very much against Islamic rule, against theocratic rule, and against clerical rule. I mean, many of the slogans are focused on this issue. So even if people are believers, they don't necessarily want to live in an Islamic state in the same way that someone can be Christian but not want to live in a Christian state with the law of the Bible being the law of the land. But the other issue too is, I'm sorry about that again. The other issue too is that people can, of course, not necessarily only be Muslims because they happen to live in Iran. There are lots of atheists in Iran, there are lots of agnostics in Iran and secularists in Iran. And of course, you know, there is a tsunami of atheism in the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, countries where Islamic rules are being imposed. So just, you know, by geography, lottery of birth doesn't necessarily make everyone a Muslim. But also there's a big difference between being a believer and wanting to live in a theocratic state.
And speaking of the geography, one of the things I kind of noticed with this, the protests here seem to be a little more widespread than they were in 2009, where they seem to center on Tehran. You know, here there's even protests in, you know, the holy city of Qom, where Ali Khamenei studied theology, basically. So I wonder if you see any omens, good or bad, in the geography of the protests?
Well, I mean, I think in a way it's actually inspiring to see that it is not a protest in just a few major cities, but it is taking place in lots of very small cities and villages as well. I mean, over 60 cities and have had protests, and it's been going on for several days. So I think it's actually a very positive thing for this to happen. Now, the video you're showing is from the National Council of Resistance Against. That's the Mujahideen. They are also quite a regressive force in Iran, and one of the things that a lot of Western governments are trying to push them as an alternative in Iran. Now, they fought with the Iraqi government against Iran during the 80s. They mistreat members that refuse to stay with them, and so they're actually quite a regressive force. All the women who are Mujahideen are also veiled. And of course, we're in a situation in Iran where there's a huge unveiling movement. There's an anti-Islamic backlash. And so one of the things I was mentioning earlier, of not allowing Western governments to impose other regressive alternatives on Iran, is hugely important in how this will end up.
Well, so speaking of the great big elephant in the room, Donald Trump, we have a very complicated, precarious political situation here. because he wants to, he's talking about repealing what Obama has negotiated with Iran. He's been hypercritical. Of course, his tweet this morning sounded like he was in solidarity with the people. But for U.S. citizens who are watching, what do we take from you? What's the best advice on how we should be responding in Congress and the federal government?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't think Donald Trump is a friend of the Iranian people. He's not a friend of any people, including the U.S. people. I mean, this is an anti-poverty, anti-corruption, protest against unemployment. I mean, he is the representative of capitalism, really, in the world, and can't care less about the poverty in the United States, let alone poor people in Iran. I think this is an issue it's a people's protest, not a protest of the ruling elite and the ruling class. And one of the things that we need to do is separate these things. I think people are concerned that if they support the protests in Iran, that they will be supporting Donald Trump. That's not the case. What we have to do is say, we don't want Donald Trump to intervene. We are opposed to both U.S. militarism and the Islamic regime of Iran. And we're for people's protests, for freedom, for equality, for a better life, for food, for bread and roses, And I think that in that sense, we can make that distinction. We don't say that. I don't say, oh, I can't support, a progressive movement in the United States because I don't want to be on the same side as the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime is also opposed to the U.S. government. We never think like that. But when it comes to the Middle East and the third world, suddenly, we become one and the same with our regimes, and criticism becomes difficult because you're worried about how it will look vis-a-vis Trump. And I think, let's just do good old-fashioned solidarity. People in Iran need support and solidarity. They're getting killed. They're being imprisoned right now. Nonetheless, they're not stopping. They're going ahead, and they should be encouraged and supported every single step of the way.
I'm wondering about, this seems to also be a young protest, and I'm wondering, when the Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988, the mullahs, kind of rewarded childbearing, and those kids be 18, 19, 20 years old right now. Did they sort of bring this generation of protesters on themselves, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is very interesting because 70% of the population in Iran is under 30 years old. And of course, already we know that religion and young people, they don't really mix very well. Especially when you think that as a young person in Iran, you cannot do basic things that young people can do. Of course, people do them, but that's despite the regime and the rules, not because the regime is friendly towards young people. So, anything from dressing how you please to listening to music to going to a concert. Women can't sing. You can't mix. You can't go to a football game if you're a woman, because it's gender segregated. And of course, you can't openly say you're an atheist. You can't read a lot of books that you'd like. You can't even go into certain fields of study if you're a woman, for example, because your brain is not as big as men's, and you're too emotional, so you can't study certain fields of study. So you see how, in a sense, when you say that a theocracy is antithetical to people's lives, it's particularly antithetical to young people's lives. And so, of course, this anti-Islamic backlash and this resistance against an Islamic regime is coming from young people who have only known an Islamic regime. And that, again, shows the bogus nature of cultural relativism. They're born in an Islamic regime. They're Islamic. They want stonings. They want amputations. They like it. That it's their culture. It's their religion. Again, it shows how bogus that is and how universal, actually, many of our demands and desires are.
So we're actually going to take some questions from our watchers now. We get questions on Facebook, on Twitter. We've got a bunch in through email. And kind of one sort of similar question that we're getting from people is what is it exactly that the protesters want? Now, you've touched on that a little bit, but maybe if you have a better sense, be a little more explicit there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has been working up towards this latest protest has been protests over, one of the main protests has been over unpaid wages. I mean, lots of workers in Iran don't get paid for 7, 8 months. I mean, can you imagine? If you don't get your paycheck for 1 month, you could possibly miss your rent. You know, a lot of us are living without savings, paycheck to paycheck. So imagine having a family and not being paid for 8, 7, 9 months or what have you. So back paid wages. And of course, when workers come out to protest, according to the Islamic regime of Iran, it is haram, it is sinful to strike, for example. And also, you find that workers who are protesting are actually flogged. Can you imagine being flogged for going out and demanding your unpaid wages? They are imprisoned. Lots of labor leaders are in prison for long prison sentences. 10 years, 16 years for organizing May Day rallies. So there is this constant, this sort of policies which impose poverty, unemployment, and to the disadvantage of the working class. And on the other hand, there's no right to association. Only government worker associations are legal. Of course, worker groups have gone and created their own independent groups, but they're suppressed and repressed, and they face a lot of persecution. In addition to that, there's also this thing called mal bakhtagan. It's people who have lost everything. So workers who had saved whatever they had, they then invested money into these sort of investment things, which closed down, took everybody's money, and the government was involved in that. And so there were no prosecutions. And so lots of these people who are called people who've lost everything, they've lost everything, had been coming out into the streets. So these are all things that have been taking place before this latest protest. And of course, add to that, the fact that you could be imprisoned and beaten for improperly veiled. They call you bad hijabi, someone who's badly veiled, to the fact that, you can be flogged for being gay, or to being executed to being gay, to being an apostate or an atheist. All of these things have sort of culminated now into the latest protest. And I think, as I said before, what makes this different is that in 2009, there were some illusions towards the so-called reformist faction. There are none today. And in reality, the reformist faction was only put there as a way of acting as a safety valve, because the regime knows there is an explosive situation on the ground. And so now we are seeing that. It's come to fruition.
And just, I'd like to corroborate something. The New York Times and other newspapers here have been reporting that 40% of young people are unemployed in Iran. Does that figure seem about right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, imagine 40% unemployed. The regime says 1/3 live under the poverty line, but it's actually close to 2/3 of the population of the country lives under the poverty line. This at a time when the regime's officials are filthy rich, the Revolutionary Guards are filthy rich, and we live in a country with lots of oil and resources and industry. So obviously there's some, and that's why one of the main slogans is against corruption. And, a lot of the slogans are about how the government keeps getting richer and people keep getting poorer.
So instead of paying the clergy all this money, they should be paying people's wages. Let the clergy go out and do some work.
Yes, do a useful day's work at least for a change.
So
that might be very difficult. But sorry, can I just say something about the clergy, which is quite funny? And it's this anti-clericalism. There was a debate in the Iranian Islamic Assembly, their parliament, and one of the clergymen came late, and he said that he came late because no taxi would pick him up, and he had to go back and change into normal clothes so that they would pick him up. So there is this sort of feeling of real hatred towards the clergy, and you could see that in protests when they passed by. It says, "Shame on you, clergy, let go of this country." And so that anti-clericalism is very deep-seated, and it's actually something very wonderful to see in this day and age where religion is so privileged, and often, you're not allowed to criticize it because goodness forbid you offend someone.
Well, that's certainly heartening to hear. We're getting a couple questions about Trump's tweets. Specifically, they seem to be on their face supportive. Nikki Haley, our ambassador to the UN, said some, at least again, on their face supportive comments. But those seem to be at odds with the travel ban. And people seem to be wondering, how are the Iranian people perceiving this support, given that Trump is essentially banning anybody from fleeing to the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think many people take his tweets seriously. I don't think anyone takes his tweets on anything seriously, to be quite honest, because it does feel like sometimes, very often, that there's a madman running the United States. But, again, you ban Iranians, many of whom are secular, many of whom are trying to get out of the country, voting with their very feet against the Islamic regime. You homogenize an entire society and basically say that Iranians are the source of terrorism, where in fact they're fighting a terrorist regime and have been doing that for many decades. And on the other hand, now when people are out on the streets, you say that you are concerned about them. Well, again, if we look at not just historically what the United States has done in Iran, the 1953 coup d'etat, for example, of the Mossadegh government, the 1979 revolution was not an Islamic revolution, but the U.S. with other powers met in Guadeloupe and decided that they preferred an Islamic regime because that was during the Cold War, when they were trying to create a green Islamic belt around the Soviet Union at the time. So, the U.S. intervention in Iran has always been a big mess, and it's always been to the disadvantage of the population. And it's the same everywhere else in the Middle East. So I think the best thing Americans can do is to make sure that Trump doesn't intervene in Iran. The people of Iran, as you can see from the protests, are courageous. They are, they know what they want, they know what they need, and they're going for it. And I think all we should be doing is giving solidarity to people there and making sure Western governments don't make some deals behind the scene with either the Iranian regime or with opposition groups that are discredited, like the People's Mujahideen or the National Council of Iranian Resistance. So I think we need to be very wary of that.
You've talked about the role of women in the protest. Can you give, for the viewers who might not be as familiar, basically a rundown on the plight of women living in Iran? I mean, they're treated like chattel. I know, being a lawyer, that their testimony is worth half as much as a man in court. Can you kind of give some background as to why women who are so repressed might be more active in such a protest?
Yeah, I think if you look at any theocracy, whether it's Islamic or otherwise, I mean, women are the first targets, because they're seen to be extensions of the society, of the nation, of the family, of the community, and therefore they need to be controlled and managed. And I think if you look at a lot of religious rules around women, that is the main purpose, whether it's the veil, to hide women and to make sure, the property is not in view. When you look at the rules regarding women, for example, there's gender segregation, again, as a way of controlling and managing women. And if you look at Sharia laws too, women have very limited rights to divorce, to child custody, to inheritance. For example, women get half the inheritance men do. And of course, as you said, a woman's testimony is worth half that of a man's. Now, this is, the Islamic rules regarding women, but nonetheless, women in Iran are very powerful and they're very much at the forefront. This is a very female revolution. It's a very female rebellion. And I think that's very clear from the videos and protests. You can see some of the most courageous things we've seen have been from women. And again, I think it is because they are the first victims. They are also very often on the front lines of resistance. And, I think, again, this shows how ridiculous cultural relativism is, to say that women want the veil, that women, the veil is empowering and all of these things, whereas in fact, people are fighting and dying for the right not to veil and not to live under Sharia rules.
So we're also getting a lot of questions about the outcome here. Is this really a threat to the regime? And I guess I might add to that, what for you would be the best case scenario, as a result of these protests? What would you see? Something like the Persian constitutional revolution in the early 1900s? What would you want to see come out of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it's not what I decide. It's what people decide, and I think again, what as a minimum we need is an end to an Islamic regime. Look, if we're, if we just use our common sense, a theocracy has no place in the 21st century. So I think, the first thing that has to go is the regime. We cannot have any sort of real reforms, any sort of respect for rights in a theocracy, because the minute you criticize a theocracy, you are seen to be challenging God. The government officials have said it, that those protesters will be considered muharribs, people who are fighting God. The punishment for that is the death penalty. So, you need, for sure, to be able to get rid of that regime. And it has to go. It has to go. It has slaughtered an entire generation in Iran. It has committed crimes against humanity because of investments and, profit. Governments have continued to deal with this regime, and at the expense of people's rights. And I think so that's number one. We need to want an end to the Iranian Islamic regime, and that's what people want. And I think as a minimum, we need secularism. And even if people are not chanting specifically the word secular, their slogans all are demanding secularism, because they're saying they don't want clerical rule, they don't want Islamic rule, they want freedom, they want equality. So a secular society is a precondition for that. And we need a situation where there will be a space opening up, as it did in the 78 revolution, where people can begin to talk and say what they think and hear opinions other than Islamic ones, so that they can then decide on what sort of future they want. Iran has a history of building councils, which are, and this is something we saw during the revolution in 78, 79 as well, where people set up their own councils in their vicinities, and it is the best form of democratic politics there is. And again, this is something that we're hearing workers groups calling for, council rule again. And we're seeing that also in places like Rojava, where they've banned Sharia law, they've banned polygamy in free Kurdish areas. And so it's very possible. But again, there is no guarantees. You go out to fight, there's no guarantees you will win. And as you said before too, there's so many ways in which this can be then made into something else because of pressure and politics and so on and so forth. So we need to be sure that that space is left open for people to be able to decide for themselves.
So my understanding of the theology of the regime is that basically they get to stand in loco parentis. They get to act as the fathers of all Iranian citizens. And it kind of sounds like you're saying it needs to be we the people, which is what we have here. So, but we do have a follow-up question from Joe Tanjung, who asks, what is the consequence for the protesters if the protests fail?
Well, obviously the consequences will be very dire. It will be very dire in the sense that already we have, over 20 people killed, including children, and hundreds have been arrested, as can be seen from previous protests where people were raped, they were tortured, they were executed. And again, there is that potential that could happen. But of course, that's nothing new. It's 40 years of this sort of repression. In one summer in the bloody decade of the 80s, for example, 5,000 people were executed. Some of them were asked one question: do you believe in God? And if they said no, they were just taken out and shot. The trials took 1 or 2 minutes only, and they shot several hundred people in one day. So there is, they've been killing people nonstop and over a long period of time. There are people, long-term political prisoners in the country, dual nationals, for example, not like Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe or Bagher and Siamak Namazie, who've been in prison over bogus charges just because they're dual nationals. There's so many of these sorts of cases. Atena Daimi, like a children's rights activist, Nasrin Sotoudeh, a human rights lawyer, labor activists like Reza Shahabi, who've been in prison, tortured, and so on and so forth. So nothing new is going to happen. It's the same old repression. But this is a chance to change all that. This can be a historical moment in Iranian history, but also in world history, because Iran is one of the pillars of Islamism and Islamic terrorism in the world. If a secular, modern, universalist, woman-led people's revolution can overthrow this regime, it will bring such a breath of fresh air across the globe. It's in everyone's interest to defend this movement.
So, Maryam, it seems like in Iran there's always been changes through the decades, and things today are not like they were before. When you were a girl or a young woman living in Iran, was your family devout, or were you secular, or were those things important to you back then? And how do they compare to now?
Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, it was very different because and it's very different to even living here, Muslims who live in Europe now. It's day and night, really. And again, it's because of the influence of Islamism that things have become so intolerant and things have become so black and white now. But, we lived in a family where, for example, my father doesn't eat pork, he doesn't drink. He comes from a very devout family. My grandfather was a clergyman, and so was my great-grandfather. And even my last name is Namazie, which means prayer. It's very funny. So, so we lived in a family where some of us fasted, some of us didn't, some of us failed, some of us didn't. And we used to, those of us who were eating during Ramadan would eat in front of those who were fasting. Now, though, even in Britain, you can't eat in front of people who are fasting. It's offensive. So it was a very different world. Of course, during the Shah's time, it was still a dictatorship. He was a puppet of the U.S. foreign policy as well. But again, even when you look at pictures of Afghanistan many years ago, it looks like we've gone backwards rather than forwards. And the beautiful thing about the protests in Iran now is that is a 21st century image that you're seeing from people in that country, whereas the ruling elite and the government should really go back to the Middle Ages where they belong.
Well, that is a very good place to end our show, I think, Maryam. What a thrill to talk with you live from London and get the inside information from a freedom fighter born in Iran and watching this unfold. And we hope for the best, and we'll do our bit if we can, and hope our viewers will also do their bit to keep freedom alive there in Iran.
Well, there's a feeling, isn't there? There's an excitement or something. You can just feel it.
It's very, very exciting, and I'm so thankful to you for helping give me this chance to talk about this, which is something very close to my heart. But I think lots of people, even non-Iranians, are very excited about this development because it could bring a different world for us. It could.
Thank you again, Maryam Namazie.
Thank you.
That was a fascinating interview. I'm so glad we got to do that.
Thank you for joining us on Ask an Atheist today. Tune in next week live at noon Central Time on Wednesdays for the next FFRF Ask an Atheist.